She was about to fail the struggling student until his father walked into her classroom and changed everything. Sarah Mitchell had been teaching 5th grade for 12 years, and she'd seen plenty of difficult students. But Ethan Cooper was different. Not because he was disruptive in the loud, attention-seeking way that some kids were. No, Ethan's problems were quieter, more persistent, and somehow more frustrating because she couldn't quite reach him no matter what she tried. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of grey autumn day when the fluorescent lights in Riverside Elementary seemed harsher than usual, buzzing softly overhead as Sarah sat at her desk after the final bell. The classroom still smelled of pencil shavings and the faint tang of disinfectant the janitor used. 23 empty desks faced her in neat rows, and she stared at one in particular, 3rd row, 2nd seat, where Ethan spent most of his days either sleeping or staring into space. Sarah pulled out her gradebook, the old-fashioned paper kind she still preferred, despite the district's push for digital everything. Her finger traced down to Ethan's name, and her chest tightened with a familiar mix of concern and exasperation. Math, D-. Reading, F. Science, incomplete. Social studies, 2 missing assignments out of the last 3. Homework completion rate, 32%. She'd been teaching long enough to know that grades told only part of the story. Behind every failing student was a reason, a struggle, a barrier that needed to be identified and addressed. That's what she told herself every morning. That's what kept her coming back year after year despite the low pay and the growing class sizes. She genuinely cared about these kids, but caring wasn't fixing whatever was broken with Ethan Cooper. Sarah opened the thick folder she'd been compiling for weeks now, a folder she'd hoped she'd never have to use. Inside were incident reports, carefully documented observations, printed emails, and work samples that painted a troubling picture. September 10th. Ethan fell asleep during morning announcements and had to be shaken awake. September 18th. Incomplete homework for the 3rd consecutive day. September 24th. Sent to the principal's office after shoving another student in the lunch line. The pattern had only gotten worse in October. Ethan showed up to school looking like he'd dressed in the dark. Mismatched clothes, uncombed hair that stuck up at odd angles, sometimes the same shirt 2 or 3 days in a row. His backpack was a disaster zone of crumpled papers and broken pencils. He forgot his lunch at least twice a week. During silent reading time, she'd catch him with his head down on his desk, his small shoulders rising and falling with the heavy breathing of exhaustion. When she tried to talk to him, he'd look at her with those dark, hollow eyes that seemed too old for a 10-year-old boy, and mumble one-word answers. "Are you okay, Ethan?" "Fine." "Did you understand the assignment?" "Yeah." "Is something happening at home?" "Nothing." Sarah had tried everything in her considerable teaching toolkit. She'd moved his seat closer to her desk, hoping proximity would help. She'd paired him with responsible classmates for group work. She'd modified assignments, reduced homework loads, offered to let him come in during recess for extra help. She'd sent encouraging notes home, praising the smallest efforts. She'd even bought him a new backpack with her own money when his old one's zipper broke and stocked it with fresh supplies. Nothing worked. If anything, Ethan seemed to be getting worse. The breaking point had come yesterday morning. Sarah had been in the middle of explaining long division, drawing careful diagrams on the whiteboard, when she heard the sound. That distinctive rhythmic breathing that signaled a student had fallen asleep. She'd turned around to find Ethan's head on his desk, his math worksheet blank in front of him, completely unconscious. "Ethan." She'd kept her voice gentle but firm. No response. "Ethan Cooper." Louder now. Still nothing. She'd had to walk over and physically shake his shoulder to wake him. When his eyes finally opened, they were red-rimmed and unfocused, and for just a moment she'd seen something that looked like fear flash across his face before he registered where he was. The other students had giggled. Marcus Chen whispered something to the girl next to him. Sarah, had felt her patience finally crack. "Ethan, please step into the hallway." In the corridor with the classroom door closed behind them, she'd tried one more time. "Ethan, what's going on? You can't keep falling asleep in class. You can't keep ignoring your work. I want to help you, but you have to meet me halfway." He'd stared at the linoleum floor, at the scuff marks left by hundreds of children's shoes. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Sorry, Mrs. Mitchell. Sorry isn't enough anymore. I need you to tell me what's happening." "Nothing's happening." "Ethan, can I go back inside?" His jaw was clenched, his thin body rigid with tension that seemed impossible in someone so young. That evening, Sarah had received the email that tipped the scale. It was from Jennifer Martinez, mother of Sophia Martinez, one of Sarah's best students. The subject line read, "Concerns about classroom environment. Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted to bring something to your attention. Sophia has been coming home upset because she says Ethan Cooper is disrupting the class and affecting her ability to learn. Last week, he pushed her in the hallway, and yesterday she said he fell asleep during your math lesson. I understand that some children have difficulties, but I'm concerned that one student's problems are preventing my daughter from getting the education she deserves. Is there a plan to address this situation? Thank you, Jennifer Martinez." Sarah had sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen, and felt her heart sink. Jennifer wasn't wrong. It wasn't fair to the other 22 students that so much of Sarah's time and emotional energy was going toward one child who didn't seem to want help, and Jennifer Martinez wasn't the only parent who'd expressed concern. 2 weeks ago, it had been Mrs. Patterson. Before that, Mr. Yoshida. That night, Sarah had made a decision she'd been avoiding for weeks. She'd composed an email to Principal Robertson recommending that Ethan Cooper be retained in 5th grade for another year. She'd attached the documentation, summarized the interventions she'd attempted, and noted the lack of parental involvement despite her repeated attempts to make contact. "I believe Ethan needs more time to mature, both academically and socially, before moving to 6th grade. Additionally, I'm requesting a mandatory parent conference to discuss these concerns and explore possible home factors that may be contributing to his struggles. Without parental cooperation and improved performance, I cannot in good conscience promote him to the next grade level." She'd hit send before she could second-guess herself. Now, sitting in her classroom on this grey October afternoon, Sarah felt the weight of that decision pressing on her chest. She wasn't a heartless person. She didn't enjoy failing students, but she'd done everything she could think of, and Ethan's situation was affecting her entire classroom. Sometimes, as much as it hurt, you had to make tough calls. Sometimes caring meant saying no. The phone on her desk rang, startling her. She picked it up. Sarah Mitchell. "Sarah, it's Bob." Principal Robertson's voice was brisk and businesslike, the way it always was during the hectic school day. "I got your email about the Cooper boy. I agree we need to address this. The good news is I finally got through to the emergency contact number on file. Father will be here tomorrow at 3:45 for a conference." Sarah felt a jolt of surprise, mixed with grim satisfaction. Finally. "Tomorrow? That's great. I'll be ready." "Good. Look, I read through your documentation. It's thorough. You've done your due diligence here. If the parent can't or won't get this kid back on track, we may need to consider other placements." He paused. "Have you met the father before? Any parent-teacher nights?" Sarah flipped through Ethan's file to the emergency contact form. Father's name, Staff Sergeant Michael Cooper. Mother's name, deceased. That was all it said. She'd noticed it before, but hadn't given it much thought. Single parent, mother passed away. Tragic, certainly, but lots of kids came from difficult backgrounds. It didn't excuse neglect. "No, I've never met him. He's never responded to any of my emails or calls until now." "Well, hopefully we can get some answers tomorrow. I'll sit in on the conference if you want backup." "That would be helpful. Thank you." After they hung up, Sarah spent another hour preparing for the next day's meeting. She organized all her documentation chronologically. She printed out examples of Ethan's work, the half-finished assignments, the tests with more blank spaces than answers, the reading journal with empty pages. She rehearsed what she'd say, trying to find a balance between compassionate and firm. "Mr. Cooper, your son is failing. Your son is falling asleep in class daily. Your son pushed another student. Your son is affecting the learning environment for 22 other children. I've tried to reach you for 8 weeks. Where have you been?" Maybe she'd leave out that last part, but she'd definitely think it. Sarah gathered her materials, turned off the lights, and locked her classroom door. The hallway stretched out in both directions, empty and echoing. Somewhere down by the gym, she could hear the custodian's buffer humming against the floor. The smell of industrial cleaner mixed with the lingering scent of the cafeteria's lunch. Tuesday was always meatloaf day. As she walked toward the exit, she passed Ethan's locker. Someone, probably Ethan himself, had drawn on it with pencil a crude sketch that was mostly scribbled out. She paused, leaning closer. Beneath the scribbles, she could just barely make out what looked like a stick figure. No, 2 stick figures. One tall, one small, holding hands. Above them, also scribbled out but still faintly visible, "Me and Dad." Sarah felt something twist in her chest, but she pushed it away. Lots of kids loved their parents, even when those parents weren't doing their jobs. Tomorrow, she'd find out exactly what kind of father would let his son deteriorate like this. Tomorrow, she'd hold someone accountable. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, everything she thought she knew about Ethan Cooper and his family would shatter into pieces, and that she'd be the one left picking them up, with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face. But that was tomorrow. Today, she went home with her mind made up and her documentation ready, prepared to do what needed to be done. After all, she'd given Staff Sergeant Michael Cooper every chance to be involved. Now he'd have to face the consequences of his absence. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the man who would walk into her classroom tomorrow had been fighting different battles on different ground, and that the uniform he'd wear would tell a story she'd never thought to ask about. Wednesday morning arrived cold and overcast, the kind of November weather that made the school's old radiators clank and hiss as they struggled to heat the building. Sarah Mitchell arrived early, as she always did, but today she moved through her preparations with grim determination. She'd barely slept. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she'd seen Ethan's hollow face, heard Jennifer Martinez's concerns, felt the weight of 22 other students who deserved her full attention. By the time her alarm went off at 5:30, she'd already been awake for an hour, mentally rehearsing the afternoon's conversation. The morning passed in a blur. Sarah taught fractions, supervised a spelling test, broke up an argument about playground swings. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Ethan in his usual seat, his presence somehow both disruptive and absent at the same time. Today he wore a t-shirt 2 sizes too big, hanging off his thin shoulders, his hair stuck up at odd angles, uncombed. During morning announcements, his eyes kept drooping shut, his head nodding forward before he'd jerk himself awake. During the spelling test, Sarah watched him stare at his paper for 10 minutes before writing a single word. At lunch, Maria Hernandez slid into the seat across from her. "You okay? You look stressed." Sarah stabbed at her salad. "Parent conference this afternoon, the Cooper boy. The father's finally showing up?" "Finally." Sarah set down her fork. "Maria, I've sent 12 emails. 12. I've called 8 times and left messages. I've sent notes home. Nothing, not a single response until yesterday. What do you think is going on?" Sarah leaned back, the plastic chair creaking. "Honestly, I think we're dealing with a parent who just doesn't care. Single father, works a lot probably, sees the kid as a burden. Classic neglect situation." "You can't save kids whose parents won't participate," Maria said gently. "I know. I just feel like I'm giving up on him." "You're not giving up. You're holding his parent accountable. There's a difference." Sarah wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. At 3:15, the final bell rang. Students erupted from their desks, backpacks zipped, chairs pushed in, a chorus of, "Bye, Mrs. Mitchell." Ethan was the last to leave, moving slowly, methodically, stuffing papers into his disaster of a backpack. "Ethan, your father is coming in for a conference today at 3:45. He froze. Something flickered across his face. Fear, anxiety. "Okay," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "It's nothing to worry about. We're just going to talk about how to help you do better." He nodded once, quickly, and practically fled down the hallway. By 3:30, her classroom was transformed. She'd arranged 3 chairs near her desk. Her documentation was organized in a blue folder. Attendance records on top, then behavior reports, then work samples showing Ethan's progressive decline. She'd also pulled Ethan's cumulative file. His second-grade teacher had written, "Ethan is a delightful student, curious, kind to his classmates, and eager to learn." 4th grade was where things changed. "Ethan has struggled significantly this year following a family tragedy. Recommend continued monitoring and support." Family tragedy. Sarah checked the emergency contact form. Mother, deceased. Ethan's mother, Rebecca Cooper, had died in March of his 4th grade year, just over 2 years ago. Sarah felt a small pang of sympathy but pushed it aside. Lots of children lost parents. It was tragic, but it had been 2 years. At some point, there had to be adjustment, healing, and that's exactly why parental involvement was crucial. A grieving child needed more support, not less. Where had this father been? At 3:42, Principal Robertson appeared. "You ready?" "Ready? I'll be in my office if you need me. Just be direct, professional, and lay out the facts." He checked his watch. "He should be here any minute." After Robertson left, Sarah walked to the window. The parking lot was mostly empty. She watched a dark blue pickup truck pull into a visitor spot. A man got out, and even from the 2nd floor she could see the military uniform. Distinctive digital camouflage. Her stomach tightened. She'd known he was military. Staff sergeant, the form said, but seeing the uniform made it real. She reminded herself that military service didn't make someone a good parent. The uniform didn't change the facts. This man had ignored her communications for 2 months while his son fell apart. She moved behind her desk, wanting the physical barrier between them. Footsteps in the hallway, different from teachers' soft-soled shoes, boots on linoleum, coming closer. A knock on the doorframe, 3 sharp raps, military precise. "Come in," Sarah called. Staff Sergeant Michael Cooper stepped into her classroom, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed assumptions begin to crack. He was younger than expected, probably mid-30s, with close-cropped dark hair silvering at the temples. The Army combat uniform was crisp and pressed, name tape over his right pocket, rank insignia on his chest, on his left shoulder, a combat patch showing he'd served in a war zone. Above his left pocket, rows of ribbons, including the distinctive purple and white of a Purple Heart. But it was his face that stopped her. His jaw was tight, controlled, as if maintaining composure required tremendous effort. His eyes, the same dark, hollow eyes she saw every day in his son, had shadows beneath them that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion. A small scar along his right cheekbone, still pink, still healing. And as he took 2 steps into the room, she noticed the limp. Subtle, well compensated, but definitely there. This wasn't what she'd imagined. "Mrs. Mitchell?" His voice was quiet, respectful. "I'm Michael Cooper." "Ethan's father." Sarah stood, extending her hand. His handshake was firm but brief, and she noticed the calluses on his palm, the way his hand trembled slightly before he clasped both hands behind his back. "Please sit down." He sat, back straight, hands on his knees. Everything about his posture screamed discipline and control, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw muscle jumped. Sarah settled into her chair and pulled the blue folder toward her. "Staff Sergeant Cooper, thank you for coming in. I know you're aware that I've been trying to reach you for several weeks regarding Ethan's performance and behavior." Something flickered in his expression. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for not responding sooner. The messages didn't reach me through the right channels until yesterday. Excuses already. Sarah felt irritation flare. I sent emails to the address on file. I called the phone number. I sent notes home with Ethan. I understand, it's my fault. I should have updated my contact information. He paused, swallowing hard. Can you tell me what's going on with my son? She opened the folder. Ethan is currently failing 3 subjects and receiving a D in the 4th. His homework completion rate is 32%. He falls asleep in class 3 times per week on average. He's had 4 behavioral incidents, including pushing another student. She slid papers across the desk. These are examples of his work, or lack thereof. Cooper took the papers with steady hands and began looking through them. Ethan's math test. 12 problems, 5 attempted, 2 correct. Reading comprehension. Blank spaces. Science project missing entirely. Sarah watched his face. She'd expected defensiveness, maybe anger. What she saw looked like pain. His throat worked as he swallowed. His hands tightened on the worksheets until his knuckles went white. I didn't know it was this bad, he said finally, barely above a whisper. That's because you haven't been involved. Sarah heard the edge in her voice. Staff Sergeant Cooper, I've taught for 12 years. I understand that parenting is hard, that work demands can be challenging. But your son is falling apart, and he needs you to step up. The other students are being affected. Their parents are complaining. I can't let this continue. He looked up, and the expression on his face made her words die in her throat. It wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was devastation. You're right, he said, his voice cracking. You're absolutely right. Ethan needs more from me. He gathered himself visibly. Can you tell me everything? All of it. I need to know, Sarah told him. She walked through the timeline of Ethan's decline, week by week. How he fell asleep during lessons. How he'd stopped participating. How his hygiene had deteriorated. The pushing incident. The missing homework. The blank stares. He won't talk to me, Sarah said. I've tried to reach him to understand what's going on, but he shuts down. Without knowing what's happening at home, without parental support, I can't help him. Cooper sat completely still, his gaze fixed past her shoulder. When she finished, silence filled the classroom. Finally, he spoke. Mrs. Mitchell, may I ask you a question? Of course. What do you think is wrong with Ethan? Based on everything you've seen, what do you believe is causing this? Sarah blinked, surprised. Honestly, I think he's not getting adequate support at home. I think he's staying up too late, probably unsupervised. I think homework isn't being prioritized. I think there's a lack of structure and consistent parenting. He nodded slowly. That's fair. Based on what you've observed, that's a reasonable conclusion. He paused. You're wrong, but it's reasonable. I'm wrong? Yes, Mum. He met her eyes directly. You're wrong about what's happening, but you're right that Ethan needs help. You're right that I should have responded sooner. You're right that this is my responsibility. He took a breath. But before you make any final decisions about my son, I need to tell you some things that might change your understanding. Sarah felt irritation flare again. Staff Sergeant Cooper, I don't think... Please. The word was quiet but carried weight. Just let me explain. After that, whatever you decide about Ethan, I'll accept it. But you deserve to know the whole story. Sarah looked at him, at this man in his combat uniform with his purple heart and his exhausted eyes. Something in her teacher's instinct was suddenly screaming that she needed to listen. All right, she said. I'm listening. Cooper looked down at his hands, then back up. Ethan's mother, my wife Rebecca, died 26 months ago. Breast cancer. She was 33 years old. He paused, swallowing hard. I was deployed in Afghanistan when she got sickest. I was in Kandahar when she went into hospice. I was on a convoy patrol when she died. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. I came home for the funeral on emergency leave, 10 days total. Then I had to go back to finish my deployment. Ethan was 8 years old, and I had to leave him with my sister to go back to a war zone. His voice cracked. That's when the nightmares started for him. That's when everything started to fall apart. He looked directly at her now, and Sarah saw the full weight of what he'd been carrying. So, yes, Mrs. Mitchell, you're right that Ethan needs more support at home. You're right about all of it. He leaned forward. But I need you to understand something. He paused, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed narrative begin to crumble. I'm not neglecting my son, Michael Cooper said, his voice breaking. I'm drowning trying to save him. The classroom suddenly felt too small. Her documentation sat between them, and she realized with growing horror that every assumption she'd made had been built on ignorance. Tell me, she said softly. Tell me everything. And as Staff Sergeant Michael Cooper began to speak, Sarah Mitchell felt everything she thought she knew begin to shatter and reshape itself into something she'd never seen coming. Michael Cooper's hands were trembling visibly now, no longer hidden by military discipline. He looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else, then clasped them together tightly. After Rebecca died, he began, his voice steady but hollow, I had 8 days left of emergency leave before I had to fly back to Afghanistan. 8 days to bury my wife, comfort my son, and somehow prepare him for me to leave again. He paused, his jaw working. Ethan was 8 years old. He'd just watched his mother die over 6 months while I was halfway around the world. And then I had to look him in the eye and tell him I was going back. Sarah sat frozen behind her desk, her carefully prepared documentation suddenly feeling obscene in its neat organization. My sister took him. Good woman, has 3 kids of her own in Charlotte. But Ethan, Cooper's voice caught. He stopped talking for 3 weeks, just stopped, wouldn't speak to anyone. My sister said he'd sit in the guest room and stare at the wall, wouldn't play with his cousins, wouldn't go to school, just disappeared inside himself. The radiator clanked and hissed, but Sarah barely heard it. She was watching this man, this soldier who'd been trained to maintain composure under fire, slowly come apart in her classroom. I was supposed to be gone 4 more months. I called every chance I got, which wasn't often. Sometimes weeks would go by. When I did get through, Ethan would talk to me, but it was like talking to a recording. I'm fine, Dad. Yes, Dad. I love you too, Dad. No emotion. Nothing. Cooper dragged a hand across his face. My sister said the nightmares were getting worse. He'd wake up screaming that I was dead, that everyone was going to die and leave him alone. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She glanced at the blue folder on her desk, at Ethan's failing grades and behavior reports, and suddenly saw them differently. Not as evidence of neglect, but as symptoms of something much deeper. I requested early redeployment, compassionate reassignment, but the military doesn't move fast, Mrs. Mitchell. It took 6 weeks to process the paperwork, another 2 weeks to find my replacement, then transport out of country. His voice hardened slightly, not with anger, but with bitter experience. By the time I got stateside, Ethan had been without either parent for 5 months. 5 months of living with relatives who loved him but weren't his parents. 5 months of going to bed every night, terrified he'd wake up an orphan. Cooper reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers shook as he unlocked it and scrolled through photos. He turned the screen towards Sarah. The first photo showed a family of 3. A younger Michael Cooper in civilian clothes, arm around a beautiful woman with long dark hair and a warm smile. Between them, a small boy, maybe 6 years old, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed joy. They were at a beach somewhere, sunshine and sand and happiness frozen in pixels. That's Rebecca, Cooper said softly. That was taken 3 years before she got sick, before everything fell apart. He swiped to the next photo. The same woman, but different now. Thin, almost skeletal, wearing a headscarf. Still smiling, but the smile looked like it cost her everything. Young Ethan sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand, his face solemn and frightened. This was 2 weeks before she died. I wasn't there. I was in Kandahar. Cooper's voice cracked on the location. My sister took this and sent it to me. I stared at this photo for hours, Mrs. Mitchell. I memorized every detail because I knew it was probably the last time I'd see her alive. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back, maintaining professional composure, but it was getting harder. Cooper swiped again. This photo showed him in full combat gear, helmet, body armor, weapon, standing in a desert landscape with other soldiers. He looked exhausted, dirt-streaked, older than in the family photo despite only 2 years passing. This was taken the day before Rebecca died. My platoon was running convoy security outside Kabul. We hit an IED, improvised explosive device. That's where I got this. He touched the scar on his cheekbone. And this, he gestured to his right leg. Shrapnel. I was medivaxed to Bagram, spent 4 days in the hospital there before they cleared me to travel for the funeral. He swiped to another photo, and Sarah felt her stomach drop. It showed a small boy in an oversized black suit standing beside a flag-draped coffin. Ethan's face was blank, empty, his eyes staring at nothing. An older woman, probably Cooper's sister, had her hand on his shoulder. But Ethan looked utterly alone, despite being surrounded by people. That's my son at his mother's funeral. I'm standing about 10 feet away taking this picture because I needed to document it. Needed to remember this moment. Cooper's voice was hollow now. He didn't cry. Not once during the entire service. Just stood there like a statue. The grief counselor said he was in shock, that it would hit him later. She was right. He put the phone face down on the desk, as if he couldn't look at the images anymore. When he looked up at Sarah, his eyes were red-rimmed but dry. I came back to Fort Bragg 7 months ago, got reassigned to a non-deployable unit. Training command. Ethan and I moved into base housing, just the two of us, and that's when I realized how badly I'd failed him. Staff Sergeant, Sarah started, but he held up a hand. Please, let me finish. He took a shaky breath. Rebecca was the parent who handled everything. School communications, homework, doctor's appointments, meal planning, bedtime routines. She was a teacher herself, 2nd grade. She was good at all of it, and I was deployed so much that I never learned. I never had to learn because she was there handling everything. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. How many times had she made assumptions about single mothers being overwhelmed while assuming single fathers were simply negligent? How many times had she failed to see that some parents weren't avoiding responsibility? They were drowning in roles they'd never been prepared for. When we moved here in August, I thought a fresh start would help. New school, new house, new beginning. But Ethan, Cooper's voice dropped. Mrs. Mitchell, my son is terrified every single day that I'm going to die and leave him completely alone. He knows what combat does. He knows what IEDs are. He saw his mother waste away for 6 months. He's 10 years old, and he's seen more death and loss than most adults. He leaned forward, his military bearing completely gone now, replaced by raw, paternal desperation. The reason Ethan falls asleep in class. He has nightmares every single night. Every night, Mrs. Mitchell. He dreams that I'm back in Afghanistan, that I've been killed, that he's alone. He wakes up screaming around 2 or 3 in the morning. I go to his room, hold him until he calms down, and then he crawls into bed with me because he's terrified if he loses sight of me, I'll disappear. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her chest, pressing against the ache there. So we're both awake half the night. Then I have to be at formation at 600 hours, 6 a.m. I wake him up at 5:30 so I can drop him at the before-school program on base before I report for duty. He's running on 4 or 5 hours of broken sleep every single day. Cooper's voice was rising slightly now, not with anger, but with the desperation of a man who'd been holding this inside for too long. The incomplete homework? I'm trying, Mrs. Mitchell. I swear to God I'm trying. But I don't remember 5th grade math. I don't know how to do these reading comprehension strategies. Rebecca would have known. She taught elementary school for 8 years. But I'm a soldier. I know how to clear rooms and run patrols and maintain equipment. I don't know how to help my son write a 5-paragraph essay about his favorite season." He dragged both hands through his short hair, disrupting the military precision. "I sit with him every night at our kitchen table, every single night. We try to do homework together, but I'm exhausted from 12-hour duty days. He's exhausted from nightmares and grief, and we sit there staring at worksheets that might as well be in a foreign language, and I watch my son's eyes fill with tears because he can't do it, and I can't help him." Sarah felt something crack in her chest. She thought of all those missing assignments, all those zeros in her grade book, and suddenly saw them differently. Not as a child who didn't care, but as a child and father drowning together. "The behavioral issues," Cooper continued, his voice rough now. "Ethan has what the VA psychiatrist calls complicated grief, combined with anxiety and possible PTSD. He's 10 years old and he's in therapy twice a week. The anger, the outbursts, they're not because he's a bad kid. They're because he's carrying trauma that would break most adults." He pulled his phone back out, swiped to another photo. This one showed a child's drawing in crayon. A stick figure with yellow hair, clearly meant to be Ethan. Next to him, a much larger stick figure in what looked like a military uniform. Above them, drawn in careful child's handwriting, "Please don't die, Daddy." Below, in messier script, "I miss Mommy. He drew this last week in therapy. His counselor sent it to me." Cooper's voice finally broke completely. "This is what my son thinks about. This is what keeps him awake at night. Not math homework or spelling tests. He's wondering if he's going to lose me too." Sarah couldn't stop the tears now. They spilled down her cheeks as she stared at that child's drawing, at that desperate plea written in crayon. "The reason his clothes are mismatched?" Cooper gave a bitter laugh. "Rebecca used to lay out his clothes every night. She knew what matched, what fit, when things needed to be washed. I'm learning, but I'm not good at it yet. Sometimes Ethan dresses himself in the dark at 5:30 in the morning, and I don't notice until we're already in the car." He swiped to another photo. A school lunch. A sandwich, some carrots, an apple and cookies, packed in a plastic container. "I pack his lunch every morning. I try to remember to put in vegetables and healthy options, but sometimes I forget. Sometimes we're running late and I throw in whatever's fastest. Rebecca would have meal planned and prepped everything perfectly. I'm doing my best, but my best isn't her." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring about her makeup anymore. "The emails you sent, the ones I didn't respond to?" Cooper's voice was steadier now, as if unburdening himself was giving him strength. "I didn't get most of them. The email address on file was Rebecca's. She set up all the school accounts. After she died, I didn't know to check it. Didn't even think about it. The phone number was our old landline from North Carolina that we disconnected when we moved. The notes you sent home with Ethan." He paused. "Half the time they never made it out of his backpack. The other half, I found them 3 days later crumpled at the bottom of his bag." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and smoothed it on the desk. Sarah recognized her own handwriting. "Mr. Cooper, I need to discuss Ethan's performance. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. I found this one yesterday. It's dated 3 weeks ago. I called the school immediately, and here I am." His hands were shaking again. "I'm not ignoring you, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm failing at a job I was never trained for, and my son is paying the price." The classroom was silent, except for the hiss of the radiator and Sarah's ragged breathing. She stared at the documentation in her blue folder, her careful evidence of neglect, and felt shame burn through her chest like acid. "Staff Sergeant Cooper," she began, her voice thick with tears. "There's more," he interrupted quietly. "You need to know everything before you decide about Ethan's future." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "The pushing incident in the lunch line? I talked to Ethan about it that night. The boy who bumped into him said something, asked Ethan if his mom was dead because that's why he looked homeless." Cooper's jaw tightened. "Ethan shoved him and ran. Then he hid in the bathroom and cried for an hour because yes, his mother is dead, and yes, sometimes he does look homeless because his father doesn't know how to be a mother too. Sarah felt physically ill. She remembered that incident, remembered writing up the behavior report, recommending consequences, thinking Ethan was just another aggressive child who needed discipline. I'm working with the base mental health clinic. Ethan sees a child psychologist twice a week. I see someone too, PTSD therapy. The nightmares aren't just Ethan's, Mrs. Mitchell. I have them too. Sometimes he wakes me up screaming, and sometimes I wake him up screaming. We're both broken, and we're trying to put each other back together, but neither of us knows how. He pulled out one more photo. This one showed Ethan sleeping on a couch, curled into a ball, clutching a framed photograph to his chest. Even in the phone's small screen, Sarah could see it was the beach photo, the happy family that no longer existed. This is how I find him most mornings, asleep on the couch, holding a picture of his mother. He won't sleep in his bed anymore, says it's too far from my room, says he needs to be able to hear me breathing so he knows I'm still alive. Cooper set the phone down and looked directly at Sarah, and the raw pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. So when you say I haven't been involved, you're absolutely right. I haven't been involved enough. I haven't figured out how to be both parents. I haven't learned how to navigate school systems and homework strategies and proper nutrition. I haven't mastered making my son feel safe when the world took away his safety. I haven't succeeded at being the father Ethan deserves. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. But Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to understand. I'm not absent because I don't care. I'm absent because I'm fighting a war I don't know how to win, and my son is fighting the same war. We're both doing our best with broken weapons and no reinforcements. The silence that followed felt sacred somehow, too heavy to break with words. Sarah sat behind her desk with her neat documentation and her professional judgments, and felt the full weight of how badly she'd failed this child. She'd seen the symptoms, but never asked about the disease. She'd documented the behavior, but never questioned the cause. She'd judged the father without ever trying to understand his battle. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered finally. "Staff Sergeant Cooper, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have asked, should have tried harder to understand, but I didn't know." "You couldn't have known," Cooper said quietly. "I didn't tell anyone. Military families. We're trained to handle things internally. We don't ask for help because that's seen as weakness. But Ethan is drowning, and I'm drowning, and I can't save us both alone." He looked at her with desperate hope flickering behind the exhaustion. "So, please, before you recommend holding Ethan back or transferring him or whatever you were planning to do, please tell me there's another way. Tell me how to help my son, because I'll do anything, Mrs. Mitchell. I'll quit the army if I have to. I'll move schools, get different therapy, hire tutors, anything. Just please don't give up on him." And in that moment, sitting in her classroom with this broken soldier and her broken assumptions scattered around her like debris, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. But first, she had to do something she rarely did, something that went against every professional instinct she had. She had to admit that she'd been completely, utterly, devastatingly wrong. Chapter 4. The revelation deepens. Sarah Mitchell sat in silence for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against her desk as if the solid wood could somehow anchor her. Everything she'd believed about Ethan Cooper had been inverted, turned inside out. "Staff Sergeant Cooper," she finally said, her voice trembling, "I need to apologize to you." He looked up, surprise flickering across his exhausted features. "Ma'am, you don't— No, please, let me say this." Sarah pulled the blue folder toward her and opened it, staring at the documentation she'd compiled with such confidence. "I spent weeks building this case against you. Weeks documenting what I believed was your failure as a parent. I was prepared to recommend that Ethan be held back, possibly transferred. I was ready to label you as negligent." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "And I never once asked the right questions. I never once considered that there might be a story I wasn't seeing. I saw a struggling child and assumed the worst about his father, instead of trying to understand the truth. Mrs. Mitchell, I failed your son, Sarah continued, her voice breaking. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared about the wrong things. I cared about test scores and homework completion and classroom disruption. But I didn't care enough to see past the surface, to understand that Ethan wasn't acting out. He was crying out. Cooper's jaw tightened, and she saw him swallow hard. Sarah closed the folder and pushed it aside. Everything you've told me changes everything. I'm not going to recommend holding Ethan back. I'm not going to give up on him. Instead, I need you to help me understand how to support him properly. Because clearly, I've been approaching this completely wrong. She saw something shift in Cooper's expression, the desperate tension easing slightly, replaced by cautious hope. Can you tell me more, Sarah asked gently, about what happens at home, about how Ethan gets through his days? Cooper nodded slowly. Our mornings start at 5:30. I wake Ethan up, and half the time I find him on the couch or on the floor outside my bedroom door. He does that when the nightmares are really bad, sleeps right outside my door so he can hear me breathing. Sarah felt her chest tighten. We have about 20 minutes before we leave. He gets dressed while I'm in the shower, and sometimes the clothes match and sometimes they don't. We eat breakfast in the car most mornings, cereal bars or toaster waffles, whatever's quick. Rebecca would have made actual breakfast. You're doing what you can, Sarah said softly. I drop him at the before-school program on base at 5:55. It opens at 6 for military families. Then I work from 6 in the morning until 6 at night. I'm in charge of training new recruits at Fort Liberty. I try to leave early to pick up Ethan by 4:30, but I can't always. Sometimes there are meetings or training exercises that run long. On those days, Ethan stays in after school until 6 or even 6:30. Then we get home, and we're both exhausted. Sarah thought about all those times Ethan had fallen asleep in her afternoon classes. The boy was probably running on empty by lunch. We tried to do homework right away, but Cooper's voice trailed off. Mrs. Mitchell, I barely graduated high school myself. I joined the Army at 18 because college wasn't an option. 5th grade curriculum. I don't understand half of what they're asking him to do. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo of a homework assignment. This one from 2 weeks ago. Use the distributive property to solve multi-digit multiplication problems. I don't know what the distributive property is. I looked it up on YouTube, watched 3 videos, and still couldn't figure out how to explain it to Ethan. Sarah recognized the assignment, one she'd marked incomplete. We spent an hour and a half on that worksheet. Ethan was crying because he couldn't do it, and I couldn't help him. I was getting frustrated, which made him more upset. Finally, I told him to leave it blank, and we'd ask the teacher for help the next day. Cooper's voice was hollow. But he never asked you, did he? Asking for help means drawing attention to himself, Sarah said quietly. And drawing attention means people might ask questions, might make him talk about his mother. Exactly, Cooper said. Ethan has learned that staying invisible is safer than being seen. If no one notices him, no one can hurt him. Sarah felt the truth of it settle heavily on her shoulders. After homework, or after we give up on homework, I try to make dinner. I'm getting better at it. Spaghetti, tacos, grilled chicken, basics. But by the time we get home, it's already 6:30 or 7. There's no time for anything else. Cooper's voice grew quieter. Ethan used to play soccer, used to love it. But between my work schedule and his therapy appointments, I can't get him to practices or games. So he had to quit. He used to have friends from his old school, but we moved 3 hours away and I haven't figured out how to arrange play dates. He's isolated, Mrs. Mitchell, and I don't know how to fix that. Sarah thought about how she'd judged Ethan for not engaging with other students during group work. She'd interpreted his isolation as defiance when it was actually survival. The bedtime routine is complicated, Cooper continued. Officially, bedtime is 8:30, but Ethan can't fall asleep. He lies in bed terrified that if he falls asleep something bad will happen, that I'll die in my sleep or disappear. He stood up suddenly and walked to the window, his limp more pronounced. Some nights I sit in his room until he falls asleep. I bring my laptop and do paperwork while he watches me, but then I'm staying up until midnight finishing work. Other nights he comes to my room at 9 or 10, and I let him stay. He curls up with that picture of Rebecca, and that's the only way he can rest. And then the nightmares start, Sarah said softly, between 2 and 3 a.m., like clockwork. Sometimes it's him screaming, sometimes it's me. The PTSD isn't just his, Mrs. Mitchell. I have dreams about the convoy that hit the IED, about my friends who didn't make it home, about being in that hospital while Rebecca was dying and I couldn't reach her. Cooper's voice cracked. Sometimes Ethan wakes me up from my nightmares. A 10-year-old boy shaking his father awake, telling him it's okay, that we're safe. What kind of father lets his son carry that burden? A father who's human, Sarah said firmly. A father dealing with trauma himself while trying to help his son through trauma. He shook his head. After the nightmares, neither of us can sleep. So we end up downstairs at 3 in the morning watching old cartoons or nature documentaries. And then, at 5:30, my alarm goes off and we start the whole cycle again. Sarah tried to imagine living that way, tried to imagine being that exhausted, that overwhelmed, and couldn't. Cooper returned to his chair. The school probably sees a single father who's not involved. But I'm at every therapy appointment. I'm at every check-in with the grief counselor. I'm at the VA 3 times a week for my own treatment. I'm watching YouTube videos about homework. I'm reading books about childhood grief. He pulled a worn paperback from his cargo pocket. Pages bent, covered with highlighted passages. The title read, "The Grieving Child, A Parent's Guide." I carry this everywhere. I read it during lunch breaks, between training sessions. I'm trying to learn how to be what he needs. Sarah reached across the desk and touched his hand briefly. You're not behind. You're right there with him, fighting the same battle. Cooper looked at her hand on his, moisture gathering in his eyes. The reason I didn't respond to your emails, it wasn't because I don't care. It's because I'm drowning in so many systems. Military medical, VA mental health, grief counseling, school paperwork, insurance claims, that things fall through the cracks. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket. This is a letter from the school district from September, about some family support program. I found it last week, in a pile of mail I hadn't opened. 2 months too late. Sarah took the envelope, recognizing the school district logo, services that might have helped if Cooper had known about them in time. I know I should have done better, Cooper said. I know I should have been more organized, more like Rebecca would have been. But Mrs. Mitchell, I'm doing everything I can think of, and it's still not enough. You're not failing him, Sarah said firmly. You're surviving an impossible situation. Cooper wiped his eyes. The other parents don't see it that way. I've heard the whispers at school pickup. Never responds to emails. Kid always looks like a mess. Poor child must not have proper supervision. Sarah felt shame burn through her chest because she'd thought exactly those things. Maybe Ethan would be better off somewhere else, Cooper continued. With my sister in Charlotte where there are more supports. Maybe I'm being selfish, keeping him with me when I clearly can't give him what he needs. No, Sarah said sharply. That child needs you, not your sister, not a program. You. You're his father. You're the one constant in his life. Sending him away would destroy him. Cooper looked up at her, desperate hope in his expression. What Ethan needs, Sarah continued, her mind racing, is support. What you both need is support, not separation, not judgment. You need people who understand what you're dealing with and are willing to help you navigate it. She stood up, pacing to her filing cabinet. The school has resources, academic intervention programs, counseling services, modified homework plans, accommodations for students dealing with trauma. I should have suggested these weeks ago. Cooper watched her, that military bearing returning slightly. "And I can help directly," Sarah said. "I can adjust my approach with Ethan in the classroom. I can modify assignments. I can give him safe spaces when he needs them. I can stop seeing his struggles as defiance and start seeing them as symptoms of pain." She turned back to face him. "But I need you to work with me. Can you do that? Can we form a partnership? You, me, Ethan's therapists, the school counselor, all working together?" For the first time since entering her classroom, Michael Cooper's face showed something other than exhaustion and despair. It showed hope. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice stronger. "Yes, I'll do whatever it takes." Sarah smiled, feeling her purpose as a teacher returning. "Then here's what we're going to do." She spent the next 20 minutes outlining a comprehensive support plan, reduced homework with modified assignments, permission for Ethan to take breaks when overwhelmed, a signal system he could use when he needed a moment alone, connection with the school's grief counselor, academic tutoring 3 times a week, modified attendance expectations for therapy appointments. Cooper listened intently, taking notes on his phone, his military training evident in how he processed information. "I'll also connect you with other military families at our school," Sarah added. "We have at least 4 other students with parents at Fort Liberty. Some have dealt with deployment, with loss, with similar challenges. Having a community can make all the difference." "I didn't know there were other military families here," Cooper said quietly. "I thought we were alone." "You're not alone," Sarah said firmly. "You've been alone because nobody told you there were others fighting the same battles, but that changes now." She saw his shoulders drop slightly, tension releasing. "There's one more thing," Sarah said gently. "You need to take care of yourself too. The PTSD treatment, you need to stick with it because Ethan needs you to be healthy and you can't pour from an empty cup." Cooper nodded. "My therapist says the same thing. But it's hard to prioritize myself when he needs so much." "I know, but both things have to happen simultaneously. You have to heal together." They talked for another 10 minutes about logistics, about communication, about next steps. Sarah gave him her personal cell phone number and told him to text or call any time if Ethan was struggling or if he needed advice. Finally, Cooper stood, and Sarah stood with him. He extended his hand, but she ignored it and pulled him into a brief hug. She felt him stiffen in surprise, then relax slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on him, on us." "I'm sorry I almost did," Sarah said. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was right in front of me." Cooper shook his head. "You see it now. That's what matters." As he turned to leave, Sarah called out, "Staff Sergeant Cooper, tell Ethan that I understand now. Tell him that he's safe in my classroom. Tell him that we're going to figure this out together." Cooper paused in the doorway, his back to her, and she saw his shoulders shake. When he turned back, tears were streaming down his face. "Thank you," he said again. "Thank you for seeing my son." After he left, Sarah sat alone in her classroom as the afternoon light faded. She looked at the blue folder on her desk, her documentation of failure, and felt ashamed of every assumption, every judgment. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she'd start actually helping Ethan Cooper instead of adding to his burden. Tomorrow, she'd be the teacher he needed. But tonight she had one more task. She opened her laptop and began composing an email to Principal Robertson. "Bob, after meeting with Staff Sergeant Cooper this afternoon, I need to withdraw my recommendation regarding Ethan Cooper's academic status. I was operating with incomplete information and made assumptions that were not only incorrect, but harmful. I'll be implementing a comprehensive support plan for Ethan starting tomorrow." As she wrote, Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of what it meant to be a teacher. It wasn't about maintaining order or meeting standards. It was about seeing children, really seeing them, and fighting for them even when the battle seemed impossible. Because somewhere in this town, a 10-year-old boy was going to bed terrified of nightmares, clutching a photo of his dead mother, while his father sat watch like a soldier on guard duty. And starting tomorrow, they wouldn't be fighting that battle alone anymore. The next morning, Sarah Mitchell arrived at Riverside Elementary an hour earlier than usual. The hallways were still dark and quiet, the smell of industrial cleaner mixing with the faint scent of cafeteria breakfast preparations. She unlocked her classroom door and stood in the doorway, looking at Ethan Cooper's desk, third row, second seat, with completely different eyes. That desk wasn't occupied by a problem student anymore. It was occupied by a grieving child, carrying wounds too deep for most adults to bear. Sarah had stayed up until midnight, researching trauma-informed teaching practices, military family support systems, and grief intervention strategies. She'd also called her sister a school psychologist who gave her invaluable advice. Kids dealing with trauma don't need perfect teachers. They need teachers who see them and don't give up. You can do this. At 7:45, Ethan appeared at the end of the hallway, walking slowly, backpack hanging off one shoulder. He was wearing mismatched socks and his hair stuck up in the back. But Sarah didn't see a mess anymore. She saw a child who'd been awake half the night with nightmares. "Good morning, Ethan," she said warmly. "I'm really glad you're here today." He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," he mumbled. "Come on in and get settled. Take your time." Within 5 minutes of morning announcements, Ethan's eyes were drooping. But instead of feeling frustrated, Sarah quietly placed a folded note on his desk. "If you need to put your head down and rest, it's okay. I understand. Just give me a thumbs up so I know you're okay, not sick." Ethan looked up at her with wide, confused eyes. He gave her a tiny nod. 10 minutes later, his head was on his desk. This time, Sarah didn't wake him. She simply adjusted her position so she could keep an eye on him while continuing the lesson. When he woke 20 minutes later, she quietly placed the worksheet on his desk with a note. "Try what you can. Whatever you finish is enough." He stared at the note for a long moment, then picked up his pencil. That afternoon, during the last period, Sarah pulled Ethan aside while the other students were reading independently. "Ethan, I talked to your dad yesterday. He told me about some of the hard things you've been going through." His body went rigid, eyes dropping to the floor. "You're not in trouble," Sarah said quickly. "You've never been in trouble with me. I just didn't understand what you needed, and I'm sorry, but I understand better now, and I want to help. Is that okay?" A tiny nod. "I know homework has been really hard, so I'm going to make some changes. Shorter assignments, better explanations, and if you need to rest during class because you're tired, that's okay too. Just let me know you're okay." Ethan looked up, tears gathering in his eyes. "I'm sorry I keep falling asleep. I'm trying not to. I just can't help it." "Sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. You're doing the best you can, and that's all anyone can ask." The tears spilled over. "My dad said you're going to help us. Is that true?" "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "Your dad and I are going to work together to make school easier for you. You're not alone in this, Ethan. Not anymore." For the first time since September, Sarah saw something in his expression that looked like hope. The weeks that followed were transformative. Sarah implemented every accommodation she'd researched. She reduced Ethan's homework to 20 minutes maximum and focused on quality over quantity. She created a quiet corner where any student could go if they needed a break. She modified her teaching to include more hands-on activities. She connected Staff Sergeant Cooper with 3 other military families at the school. One Marine Corps family, whose father had also deployed to Afghanistan, reached out immediately. Within a week, their son Marcus had befriended Ethan. Sarah watched as the 2 boys discovered they spoke the same language of loss and military life. The school counselor began meeting with Ethan twice a week, teaching him coping strategies for anxiety and creating a safe space to talk about his mother. Principal Robertson approved funding for after-school tutoring 3 times a week with a retired teacher who understood grief. Under this network of support, Ethan's grades began to slowly climb. Not dramatically, he was still getting C's and D's, but the trajectory was upward. Sarah also organized a classroom project about family diversity and sacrifice. She invited Staff Sergeant Cooper to speak. When he came in wearing his dress uniform, the children sat in rapt attention as he explained what military service meant and what military families sacrificed. "My wife was a teacher, just like Mrs. Mitchell," Cooper said, his voice steady despite visible emotion. "She loved helping kids learn, and my son Ethan is one of the bravest people I know because he's dealing with really hard things and still showing up every day." Sarah watched Ethan's face as his father spoke. The boy was staring at his desk, but she could see pride mixing with grief, could see him sitting a little straighter. After Cooper finished, Sophia Martinez, whose mother had once complained about Ethan, raised her hand. "Mr. Cooper, thank you for your service. And Ethan, I'm sorry about your mom. That must be really hard." Sarah had spoken with Jennifer Martinez and explained the situation. Jennifer had immediately shifted from complaint to compassion, even sending a care package to the Cooper household with home-cooked meals. The transformation wasn't immediate or perfect. Ethan still had bad days, but there were good days too. Days when he laughed during science class. Days when he volunteered an answer. Days when he played soccer at recess with Marcus and came back smiling. Sarah kept in regular contact with Cooper through text messages. One evening in early December, 3 months after that conference, she received a photo showing Ethan asleep in his own bed, not on the couch, not on the floor, but in his own bed, hugging a stuffed animal, his face peaceful. The text read, "First time he slept in his own bed in over a year. First night with no nightmares. Thank you for everything," Sarah cried. Tears of gratitude and relief. By February, Ethan's grades had climbed to mostly C's with a few B's. More importantly, he was smiling more, talking more, engaging with other students. He'd rejoined the soccer team. The nightmares were less frequent. The grief hadn't disappeared, but Ethan was learning to carry it differently. In March, on the 2-year anniversary of his mother's death, Ethan brought a photo of her for show and tell. "This is my mom. Her name was Rebecca. She died 2 years ago today from cancer. She was a teacher. I miss her every day. But my dad says she'd be proud of me for keep trying even when things are hard. So that's what I'm doing." The classroom was silent except for sniffles. Sarah was crying too. "Thank you for sharing that, Ethan," she said softly. "Your mom would absolutely be proud of you, and we're all proud of you too." That afternoon, Sarah watched from her window as Cooper picked up Ethan. Cooper scooped him up in a hug, and when he set him down, the boy was laughing. They walked toward the parking lot hand in hand, talking animatedly. Father and son, healing together. The final parent-teacher conference came in late April. Cooper arrived on time, and this time there was no folder of documentation, no evidence of failure. Instead, Sarah had prepared a portfolio showing Ethan's growth, improving test scores, creative writing, photos of him smiling and engaged. "I can't believe this is the same kid from September," Cooper said, looking through each item. "He's worked incredibly hard. You both have. We couldn't have done it without you. Mrs. Mitchell, you saved my son. You saved us." Sarah shook her head. "I just did what I should have done from the beginning." "No," Cooper said firmly. "Don't minimize what you did. You saw us. You chose compassion over judgment. You gave us hope when we had none left." They talked about summer plans. Ethan would continue therapy and attend a grief camp for military children. Things were stabilizing. As the conference ended, Cooper stood, and Sarah pulled him into a hug. "Thank you for trusting me," she said, "for giving me a second chance to get it right." On the last day of school in June, as students lined up to leave, Ethan hesitated, then threw his arms around Sarah's waist. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." Sarah hugged him back, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for teaching me to be a better teacher. Have a wonderful summer." After the last student left, Sarah walked to Ethan's desk, 3rd row, 2nd seat. She thought about that first day in September when she'd looked at this desk and seen only problems. Now she saw possibility. She saw resilience. She saw hope. She thought about all the military families across the country fighting invisible battles. Families where parents deployed to war zones and returned with wounds both visible and invisible. Children who lost parents and carried grief too heavy for their small shoulders. Single parents drowning under responsibilities they'd never been trained for. These families were everywhere, in her classroom, in every community, and they were invisible until someone chose to see them. Sarah made a promise to herself. She would always choose to see. She would always ask better questions. She would remember that the most difficult students often needed the most love. As she locked her classroom door, Sarah thought about a quote. "Every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them." She'd almost given up on Ethan Cooper, almost labeled him as a lost cause. But she'd been given a second chance, and she'd taken it. Sarah walked down the empty hallway toward the exit. Somewhere in this town, Ethan Cooper was beginning his summer, playing soccer, working with his father on coping strategies, carrying his mother's memory while learning to let joy in again, because behind every struggling child was a story that deserved to be heard. And sometimes all it took was one teacher willing to listen to change everything. If this story reminded you to look beyond the surface and choose compassion over judgment, share a time someone gave you grace when you needed it most. Have you been part of a military family navigating loss? Have you been the teacher who learned to see a struggling child differently? Military families sacrifice more than most can imagine. Not just on the battlefield, but in daily life, in grief that never heals, in children carrying burdens too heavy for their years. They're in our classrooms, our neighborhoods, our communities. If you know a military family, reach out today. Ask how they're really doing. Listen without judgment. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply see someone else's battle and stand beside them. And if you work with children, remember that behavior is communication. The most difficult students often need the most love. The children who appear not to care are often carrying pain too deep for words. Subscribe for more stories that honor the hidden struggles and quiet heroism in our communities. Stories that remind us to choose compassion over judgment, understanding over assumption, and connection over isolation. Because everyone has a story, and every story deserves to be heard.